They mocked the black waitress for her accent until she announced herself as the billionaire investor. The conference room erupted in condescending laughter as Grace Asante served coffee to the venture capital executives who dissected her Caribbean accent with the casual cruelty of people who'd never questioned their right to diminish others based on speech patterns that didn't match their narrow definition of intelligence and sophistication. "Could you repeat that, sweetheart?" Richard Hartley drawled, his voice dripping with mock concern, as Grace explained the coffee service options in the carefully measured English that carried traces of her Ghanaian heritage, like music they were too culturally limited to appreciate. At 41, Grace had spent 15 years perfecting the art of strategic invisibility that allowed her to observe without being observed, to evaluate potential business partners while they revealed their character through how they treated people they assumed had no power or influence over their professional success. The waitress uniform she wore was neither costume nor compromise. It was camouflage that provided access to authentic behavior and unguarded conversations that multi-million-dollar due diligence processes could never uncover. The Sterling Capital Partners had gathered in the private dining room of Boston's most exclusive business club to finalize investment terms for what they believed would be the acquisition of the century, a renewable energy portfolio worth $2.3 billion that would establish their fund as a major player in the clean technology sector while generating returns that would secure their reputations as visionary investors rather than the financial parasites they'd actually become through decades of exploiting other people's innovations. The stakes couldn't have been higher for everyone in that room, though only Grace understood the true dynamics of what was unfolding. The men in expensive suits believed they were negotiating with representatives of offshore investment groups whose identities remained protected by privacy laws and corporate structures designed to shield wealthy individuals from public scrutiny and regulatory oversight that might complicate their business strategies. What Hartley and his partners didn't know what their extensive background investigations and financial intelligence had somehow failed to discover was that the waitress they were mocking for her accent was Grace Asante herself, the billionaire founder of Asante Holdings, the mysterious investment group they'd been courting for months, while dreaming of management fees and carried interest that would make them wealthy beyond their modest talents and limited vision. The irony was devastating in its precision. Men who'd built careers on information superiority and strategic intelligence were being evaluated by someone they'd dismissed as domestic help, whose presence in their private negotiations was providing her with real-time assessment of their character competence and fitness for partnership in deals that would shape the future of renewable energy infrastructure across 3 continents. If you find value in real stories told with clarity and truth, make sure to subscribe to stay informed with Real Father Story. "The African help has trouble with basic English," Thomas Chen whispered to his colleague, with the kind of casual racism that revealed more about his character than any professional reference or background check could have uncovered. "Makes you wonder about the quality control at these private clubs. Standards seem to be slipping everywhere these days." Grace continued arranging documents with movements so smooth and professional that they reinforced her invisibility to men who'd never learned to see service workers as complete human beings with intelligence, education, and achievements that might exceed their own, despite accents that reflected linguistic diversity rather than intellectual limitation. The comment about African help carried particular sting because it revealed assumptions about her continent of origin, her educational background, and her social status that were completely wrong but perfectly typical of American business leaders who confused unfamiliar speech patterns with intellectual deficiency while remaining oblivious to their own cultural ignorance and linguistic limitations. Grace had been born in Accra, Ghana, to parents who'd valued education above all other investments in their daughter's future. Her father had been a university professor of economics. Her mother, a physician who'd run rural health clinics that served communities where Western medicine had been scarce and expensive. Both parents had spoken 4 languages fluently, considering multilingual communication a mark of sophistication rather than the intellectual limitation that Americans seemed to associate with any accent that didn't sound like television news broadcasts. Her childhood had been filled with dinner-table conversations about macroeconomic policy, international development theory, and renewable energy technologies that could transform African infrastructure while creating economic opportunities for communities that had been systematically excluded from global energy markets by colonial systems and neo-colonial exploitation that continued through Western corporate practices. Grace's path to Harvard Business School had begun with a full academic scholarship that had recognized her potential for business leadership while providing opportunities that her parents' modest professor and physician salaries couldn't have afforded despite their commitment to her educational advancement. Her MBA thesis on renewable energy financing in developing markets had attracted attention from professors and industry leaders who'd recognized innovative thinking that challenged conventional wisdom about risk assessment and market development. But Harvard had also taught Grace about American assumptions regarding intelligence and competence that were based on accent appearance and cultural background rather than actual performance or achievement. Classmates and professors had consistently underestimated her capabilities based on her accent, requiring her to prove herself repeatedly, while less qualified students received automatic respect and advancement opportunities based on demographic characteristics that had nothing to do with business acumen or leadership potential. The experience had been frustrating, but educational teaching Grace that American business culture was built on superficial judgments and cultural biases that created opportunities for strategic advantage when opponents underestimated her based on characteristics that actually represented advantages rather than limitations in global business environments that valued cultural competence and linguistic diversity. After business school, Grace had returned to Ghana with venture capital experience and Harvard credentials that had opened doors to international development projects and renewable energy investments that combined profit potential with social impact in ways that traditional Western investors had been too culturally limited to recognize or develop. Asante Holdings had been founded with $50 million in seed capital from family networks and African diaspora investors who'd understood that renewable energy represented the future of African development while also creating investment opportunities that could generate significant returns for investors who could navigate regulatory environments and cultural contexts that Western firms found too complex or challenging to manage effectively. The company had grown through strategic investments in solar installations, wind farms, and energy storage systems across 15 African countries, creating infrastructure that provided reliable electricity to communities that had never had consistent access to power, while generating returns that had made Grace one of the wealthiest individuals in African business history. But growth had required expansion into Western markets and partnerships with American and European firms that possessed technology and manufacturing capabilities that African companies couldn't yet provide independently. Grace's investment strategy had been to acquire significant positions in Western renewable energy companies while maintaining operational control through voting agreements and board positions that allowed her to influence strategic direction while protecting her investments from management decisions that might compromise long-term value creation. Sterling Capital had approached Asante Holdings 6 months earlier, seeking investment in their renewable energy fund that would acquire solar and wind assets across the American Southeast. Their initial presentations had been impressive detailed financial projections, regulatory analysis, and management team credentials that suggested competence and vision that could justify significant investment commitments. But Grace had learned through experience that due diligence required evaluation of character and cultural competence that couldn't be assessed through financial statements or professional biographies. The most sophisticated business plans could be undermined by management teams whose prejudices and cultural limitations prevented them from recognizing opportunities or building relationships that were essential for success in diverse markets and international business environments. The waitress role she'd assumed for today's meeting was strategic intelligence gathering that would reveal authentic behavior and attitudes that her potential partners would never display during formal presentations or structured negotiations, where they understood they were being evaluated for investment decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "I specifically requested someone who speaks proper English," Hartley complained to his assistant, with volume intentionally loud enough for Grace to hear. "How are international investors supposed to take us seriously when the service staff can barely communicate in basic business English?" The complaint revealed assumptions about language intelligence and professional competence that Grace had encountered throughout her American business education and investment career. Hartley's definition of proper English was based on American accent and cultural patterns rather than actual communication effectiveness or linguistic sophistication that included multiple languages and cultural competencies that he would never possess. Grace continued serving coffee while mentally cataloging every detail of their conversation. Management philosophy, risk tolerance, attitude toward cultural diversity, and the specific prejudices that would prevent them from building successful business relationships in international markets where renewable energy opportunities were concentrated. Her fluency in English was actually superior to most American business leaders she'd encountered, but it carried the music of her Ghanaian heritage that revealed educational background and cultural sophistication that Americans consistently misinterpreted as intellectual limitation rather than the linguistic advantage it actually represented in global business environments. "The coffee service seems acceptable despite the communication barriers," Chen commented with the kind of condescending approval that revealed more about his character than any amount of professional due diligence could have uncovered. "At least she can perform basic service functions even if conversation is challenging." The comment demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural ignorance that had led Western investors to miss opportunities in African markets that had generated extraordinary returns for investors who could navigate cultural contexts and build authentic relationships with local partners and government officials who controlled access to the most profitable investment opportunities. Grace had built Asante Holdings' success on understanding that cultural competence was business advantage rather than social nicety investors who could communicate effectively across cultural boundaries and demonstrate respect for local knowledge and capabilities generated better returns than those who imposed Western assumptions and management practices on markets that required different approaches and cultural sensitivity. But Chen and Hartley represented exactly the kind of culturally limited thinking that had prevented American firms from capitalizing on African renewable energy opportunities that had generated billions in profits for investors who'd approached these markets with respect, rather than condescension, partnership, rather than exploitation and cultural competence, rather than assumption of Western superiority. "Perhaps we should focus on the investment terms," suggested Margaret Wells, the junior partner, whose discomfort with her colleague's behavior was visible but insufficient to motivate direct challenge to prejudice that might damage her own career advancement in environments that rewarded conformity over moral courage. The investment documents spread across the conference table outlined Sterling Capital's proposed acquisition of solar and wind assets that would establish their fund as a major player in American renewable energy markets, while providing returns that would justify their management fees and carried interest arrangements that heavily favored the fund managers over the investors whose capital was actually at risk. Grace reviewed the documents while maintaining service posture, her financial analysis revealing multiple problems with their investment strategy that went beyond the cultural prejudices that had already disqualified them from serious partnership consideration. Their risk models were based on outdated assumptions about renewable energy technology costs. Their regulatory analysis ignored upcoming policy changes that would affect project profitability and their management team lacked experience in large-scale energy infrastructure development. More significantly, their approach to community relations and local partnerships reflected the same cultural arrogance they'd displayed toward her service work, assumptions about superiority that would create conflicts with local governments, environmental groups, and community organizations whose cooperation was essential for successful renewable energy project development and operation. The African investments are promising, Hartley continued, apparently unaware that Grace could hear and understand every word of their conversation about markets where she'd been operating successfully for over a decade. But we'll need to upgrade their management and operational standards to meet American efficiency and quality requirements. The comment revealed fundamental misunderstanding of African renewable energy markets that had been developed by local entrepreneurs and engineers whose technical capabilities and project management skills had actually exceeded those of most American firms that had attempted to enter these markets through acquisition rather than partnership with existing local expertise. Grace's investments in African renewable energy had been successful precisely because she'd worked with local management teams and technical capabilities rather than imposing American or European management practices that were often inappropriate for African regulatory environments and community contexts that required different approaches to stakeholder engagement and project development. But Hartley's assumption that American management was automatically superior to African expertise revealed exactly the kind of cultural arrogance that had caused Western firms to fail repeatedly in markets where success required respect for local knowledge and capabilities rather than assumptions about Western technological or managerial superiority. Local partnerships will be essential. Wells interjected her comment, suggesting better understanding of international business realities than her senior colleagues possessed. Renewable energy projects require community buy-in and regulatory cooperation that can't be achieved through purely external management approaches. The observation was accurate, but insufficient to overcome the fundamental cultural limitations that had already disqualified Sterling Capital from partnership with Asante Holdings. Grace needed investment partners who understood that cultural competence was competitive advantage rather than unnecessary complication, and that success in international markets required genuine respect for local capabilities rather than condescending assistance designed to upgrade supposedly inferior local management practices. As the meeting progressed through financial presentations and investment terms, Grace continued her strategic intelligence gathering while processing the complete mismatch between Sterling Capital's self-perception as sophisticated international investors and the reality of their cultural limitations and prejudicial assumptions that would prevent successful business development in the diverse markets where renewable energy opportunities were concentrated. The decision point came when Hartley began discussing management changes they would require in African operations that would be acquired through their investment fund. His proposals revealed complete ignorance of local regulatory requirements, community relationships, and technical expertise that had made these projects successful, while also demonstrating the kind of cultural imperialism that had caused Western investors to fail repeatedly in markets they didn't understand, but assumed they could control through financial leverage. We'll need to replace local management with experienced American executives who understand efficiency standards and quality control that meet international investment requirements. Hartley explained to his colleagues with confidence that revealed his complete ignorance of regulatory environments that required local management and community engagement that external executives could never provide. The proposal would have been devastating to existing operations while also violating regulatory requirements that mandated local ownership and management participation in renewable energy projects that had been designed to create employment and technical capability development rather than just profit extraction for foreign investors. Grace recognized that the strategic intelligence phase of her evaluation was complete. Sterling Capital had revealed character and competence limitations that made partnership impossible regardless of financial terms or investment structures they might be willing to negotiate. Their cultural prejudices and management assumptions would destroy value in international markets while also creating regulatory and community relations problems that could threaten her existing investments and business relationships. The moment for revelation had arrived. Grace stepped forward with quiet confidence that had commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar transactions, while these men had been planning investment strategies based on cultural superiority assumptions that had no basis in business reality or market performance. "Gentlemen," Grace said, her accent carrying the same musical quality they'd mocked, but now supported by authority that commanded immediate attention and respect. "I believe there has been some confusion about the structure of today's meeting and the identity of the decision-makers involved in your proposed investment partnership. The transformation was instantaneous and devastating. The invisible waitress became visible as the most powerful person in the room, her presence shifting from background service to center stage authority that left Sterling Capital's partners stunned into silence as they processed the implications of her identity and their massive strategic miscalculation. "I am Grace Asante," she continued, removing the service apron that had concealed her identity while providing perfect access to their authentic attitudes and cultural limitations. "Founder and CEO of Asante Holdings, the investment group you have been courting for partnership in your renewable energy fund." The revelation hit the room like lightning that illuminated everything they'd been too prejudiced to see. The woman they'd mocked for her accent was revealed as the billionaire investor they'd been trying to impress. The service worker they'd dismissed as intellectually limited was exposed as the financial genius whose partnership they desperately needed for their fund's success. Hartley's face transformed from condescending confidence to horrified recognition as he realized the magnitude of their cultural and strategic failure. Not only had they revealed their true character to the very person whose investment they needed, but they'd demonstrated exactly the kind of cultural arrogance that would make partnership with Asante Holdings impossible and destructive. "This is impossible," Chen stammered, his financial mind struggling to process how their due diligence had failed so completely that they'd spent 2 hours revealing their prejudices and incompetence to the billionaire investor whose partnership represented their only path to renewable energy market credibility and success. Grace's smile carried satisfaction that came from strategic victory over opponents who'd underestimated her based on accent and appearance, while revealing character limitations that made them unsuitable for partnership in international business environments that required cultural competence and respect for diverse capabilities and expertise. "I find that authentic business intelligence requires direct observation of character and cultural competence that cannot be assessed through financial presentations or professional credentials." Grace explained, her accent now clearly recognizable as the sophisticated multilingual communication that it had always been, rather than the intellectual limitation they'd imagined. The strategy revealed business acumen that exceeded anything Sterling Capital had demonstrated while they'd been making investment presentations based on cultural superiority assumptions. She'd been conducting character assessment through strategic observation that had provided complete intelligence about their fitness for partnership in international markets that required different approaches than domestic American business development. "You speak perfect English," Wells observed with wonder that revealed how completely their prejudices had prevented them from recognizing Grace's obvious intelligence and sophisticated communication capabilities that had been evident throughout their interaction. "I speak 4 languages fluently," Grace replied, her tone professional, but carrying undertones of satisfaction at having exposed their cultural limitations and prejudicial assumptions. "English, French, Akan, and Mandarin Chinese. Multilingual communication is essential for international business development though apparently not valued in American investment circles that confuse accent with intelligence. The revelation of her linguistic capabilities highlighted the gap between their narrow cultural perspectives and the global competencies required for successful international business development in renewable energy markets that spanned multiple continents and regulatory environments. The conference room fell into stunned silence as Sterling Capital's partners processed the complete reversal of their strategic position from potential fund managers to exposed bigots, from sophisticated investors to culturally limited operators whose prejudices had disqualified them from partnership with one of the world's most successful renewable energy investment groups. "What we said earlier," Hartley began desperately, "it doesn't reflect our actual views about international partnerships or cultural diversity in business relationships." Grace's response was delivered with calm authority that demonstrated the business sophistication that had built billion-dollar success through cultural competence rather than cultural prejudice. "Your comments about African management capabilities, American efficiency standards, and communication requirements revealed exactly your actual views about international business relationships and cultural diversity." She reached into her briefcase and produced documents that revealed the extent of her preparation for exactly this kind of cultural assessment, detailed analysis of Sterling Capital's previous international investments performance records in diverse markets and management team capabilities that had been evaluated against requirements for successful renewable energy project development in African and Asian markets. "These are my investment criteria for renewable energy partnerships," Grace explained, distributing copies to partners who realized their cultural prejudices had eliminated them from consideration before financial terms could even be discussed. "Cultural competence and respect for local capabilities are prerequisites for partnership in international markets where success requires authentic relationships rather than assumptions about Western superiority." The documents revealed investment standards that exceeded anything Sterling Capital could meet: requirements for cultural competence, multilingual communication capabilities, and demonstrated success in building partnerships with local management teams and community organizations that were essential for renewable energy project success in international markets. "Our fund has excellent performance records in domestic markets." Chen protested his financial background, searching for metrics that might compensate for cultural limitations that had been exposed through their treatment of Grace as service worker rather than potential business partner. Grace's laugh was confident and devastating as she produced additional documents that revealed the extent of her intelligence gathering about their actual investment performance and cultural competence. "Your domestic performance has been adequate, but your international investments have consistently underperformed due to cultural conflicts and management approaches that ignore local expertise and regulatory requirements." The revelation that their international investment record had been systematically evaluated and found deficient transformed their individual embarrassment into professional crisis that could affect their ability to raise capital from other international investors who might learn about their cultural limitations and prejudicial assumptions. "Your approach to African market development demonstrates exactly the kind of cultural imperialism that has caused Western investors to miss opportunities while creating conflicts with local partners and regulatory agencies that control access to the most profitable renewable energy projects." Grace continued her analysis, revealing complete understanding of markets where Sterling Capital had imagined they could impose American management practices without regard for local expertise and community relationships. The meeting's conclusion was swift and decisive. Sterling Capital's partners realized that their prejudicial assumptions had not only cost them partnership with Asante Holdings, but had exposed character limitations that would prevent successful international business development in renewable energy markets that required cultural competence and respect for diverse capabilities. Grace remained in the conference room, reviewing documents that confirmed Sterling Capital's unsuitability for international partnership, while processing satisfaction that came from exposing cultural prejudices that had prevented them from recognizing her intelligence capabilities and business achievements that exceeded their own. Despite accents and appearances that they'd used to justify assumptions about intellectual and professional limitations. The waitress uniform had provided perfect cover for character assessment that had revealed authentic attitudes and cultural competencies that formal due diligence processes could never have uncovered through financial analysis and professional references that reflected performance in culturally homogeneous environments rather than diverse international markets. But more importantly, the experience had confirmed that success in international business required cultural competence and linguistic capabilities that many American investors lacked, despite their assumptions about superiority based on domestic market success and English language dominance that actually represented limitations rather than advantages in global business environments. The aftermath of the failed partnership negotiations created ripple effects throughout Boston's investment community as news spread about Sterling Capital's cultural failures and the sophisticated assessment methods that had exposed their limitations to one of the world's most successful renewable energy investors. Grace's reputation was enhanced rather than damaged by the confrontation international business leaders who'd previously been skeptical about African investment capabilities now understood that Asante Holdings possessed strategic intelligence and cultural competence that exceeded those of established American firms whose domestic success had made them overconfident about international market capabilities. 6 months later, Grace testified before a congressional committee about barriers to international business development that were created by cultural prejudices and linguistic assumptions that prevented American firms from building successful partnerships in growing markets where renewable energy investment opportunities were concentrated. The waitress uniform that had made her invisible was displayed in her office as reminder of the strategic advantages that came from being underestimated by opponents who confused accent with intelligence and cultural background with capability, rather than recognizing the competitive advantages that came from multilingual communication and cultural competence in international business environments. Standing in her corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Asante Holdings continuing to exceed performance projections while expanding renewable energy investments across 4 continents, Grace reflected on how completely the tables had turned from that conference room confrontation. The men who'd mocked her accent had discovered that voices don't define intelligence or success, that linguistic diversity and cultural competence were actually competitive advantages in international business environments that required capabilities they would never possess, despite their assumptions about American business superiority. The black waitress they'd dismissed as intellectually limited had been revealed as the billionaire investor whose partnership could have transformed their careers, while their prejudicial assumptions had transformed potential success into professional embarrassment that would be remembered throughout Boston's investment community as example of how cultural arrogance could destroy business opportunities. The accent they'd mocked carried the music of multiple languages and cultural competencies that had built billion-dollar success through international business development that required exactly the kind of sophisticated communication and cultural intelligence that they'd been too prejudiced to recognize or value when it had been serving them coffee while evaluating their character and fitness for partnership in global renewable energy markets.